Tala Whalawa, kia ora from Aotearoa, New Zealand. My name is MOERA TUILAEPA-TAYLOR and I head RNZ Pacific. We are a radio station, a multimedia organisation. We broadcast into the region and most of the stories that we focus are on Pacific issues. Obviously, some of the countries most affected by climate change are in our region, so that's certainly an area that we do a lot of focus on. Part of the work we do also is, which many people might know about, we also have a cyclone watch service. In the last few years in the Pacific, obviously, we've noticed big cyclones, Winston in Fiji and Pan and Vanuatu, and they were both category 5 cyclones. So that's a lot of the work we do. We have correspondence throughout the Pacific, and a lot of them actually feedback some of the work that we do in the region. We are 13 journalists. We also have an office and a team who work out of the Auckland, but our main office is in the capital, Wellington. And in terms of stories, we have been operating in the Pacific since 1990, so we've built up a lot of strong relationships with local journalists in the region, also local, obviously, NGOs and other organisations that operate in the Pacific. You can hear us as far as the Marshall Islands and as close as Samoa and Tonga and some of our closer Polynesian countries as well. In terms of stories, so our stories cover a whole range of issues, from political issues, obviously, human interest stories as well, but we've really actually grown in terms of our coverage on climate issues or climate crisis that's in the region. A lot of our team are Pacific, so we obviously recognise the importance of being able to tell those important climate crisis stories from a Pacific lens. So that's been really important as well. And we know that we go back to the islands, we hear stories from our own people about how they've noticed that climate has really affected them over the years. So yeah, that's a lot of the work that we do. One of our journalists, obviously, as part of this panel is Dominic Godfrey, who's done quite a lot of work actually in the region covering stories on the climate. So just as you see some of our presentation that's just come up. So this is actually in Vanuatu. This was taken after actually one of the cyclones that had gone through Vanuatu. Over the years, we've really noticed that the cyclones, they're not only extreme as in category 5s, they also bring a lot more rain and wind, and they hover a lot more on countries than they did in the past. A couple of years ago, there was Cyclone Evan in Samoa, which was possibly only a category 3, but that cyclone created so much damage. It actually brought so much rain and there was severe flooding there. So that was a couple of years ago. We have quite a big area in terms of what we cover, and another thing too is we are developing more domestic Pacific stories, and that's us being able to talk to the communities here and connecting them a bit more back to the Pacific. So yeah, I think that's pretty much me, really. That's the coverage area that RNZ Pacific reaches. We now have 21 countries in the region that actually take our news bulletins, and obviously our digital footprint has really grown. We're a team of 13, but last year we had over 7 million page views, and it just seems to be getting a lot stronger. And also the Pacific diaspora, that is, we know that's a massive community. They're also really interested and passionate about some of the issues going on in our region. So this is just a rundown of some of the stuff that we do as well. We have quite a lot to do with some of the NGOs in the region who are involved in work on the ground. So I'm just going to hand it over now to Dominic Godfrey. He's one of our journalists here at RNZ Pacific, and Dominic has actually gone out and done a lot of work in the region, so it'd be quite good to hear what his perspective as well.
All right, can we have a look at the next slide? Right, this is me, Dominic Godfrey, talofa, kia ora. I'm also in Wellington here in New Zealand, Aotearoa. I'm an island boy through and through. Born in Singapore, but my parents, dad's from New Zealand, mum's from Samoa, and islands are my home. I guess the biggest island I've lived on has been Australia, which is one of the nations that obviously has a lot of influence in our part of the world, in the Pacific. But as a Pacific journalist, I guess one of the things that really strikes me, I mean, you look at our homepage on this current slide, there are 3 stories there, each covering quite a variety of subjects, but also a variety of countries. Our patch, as MOERA was mentioning, is a huge geographical area. It's the blue continent as we refer to it. But one of the challenges for journalists in this area is that tyranny of distance, because it's so hard for us to get out to the region, quite often constrained by budget, but also conscience. We don't want to be out there too often, you know, creating more carbon miles for us. So opportunities like this virtual conference are a fantastic one for us. And but it doesn't kind of counter that thing in the Pacific, because a lot of the Pacific stories are about relationships, and relationships built on trust through actually being there with people to face to tell their stories, because a lot of our stories, while driven from government or NGOs or large organizations, it's the people who are affected that really make the stories. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And one of these effects for us in the region is obviously the biggest story for our region, and that's climate change. This slide talks to the king tides that affect equatorial parts of the Pacific, particularly in low-lying countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu. This photograph is from Kiribati. I understand that one of the speakers for the latter part of this conference is Pelenise Alofa from Kiribati. During the last king tide last month, I spoke with Pelenise. We got in touch via Facebook, and such a fantastic enabling relationship builder, having Facebook friends, and allows for us to talk to each other over that tyranny of distance. And quite often in the Pacific, telephone lines aren't that great, but weirdly, the internet allows us other options through WhatsApp, Facebook, Facebook Live, and so on. But talking to Pelenise, the king tide, the effects of it, it's astronomical. People there, I think what struck me most was that people were preparing for it. People knew it was coming, and the government had done a great job in talking to people about it, and predictions and so on. And so people were going around building up their seawalls in preparation for it, because along with the king tide, the worst that can happen is if it's accompanied by swells and storms. But people were prepared, did take the time to prepare, build up their seawalls and so on. But one of the things that happens, of course, is that even in poor nations in the Pacific, there are also people who can afford things, people who can't, and the haves and have-nots. People that could afford it, could afford new cement to build up, to grind down coral and build up their new seawalls. But of course, there are families that couldn't afford that. So when I spoke with Pelenise, she was just about to go out and check on families and how they'd fared through the highest part of the king tide. And that is a really striking example of the day-to-day life and the reality for people in low-lying countries in the Pacific. Can we have a look at the next slide? And yeah, this is another example. This is the Marshall Islands, another one of our Pacific neighbours, our low-lying atoll countries. So that we have the most at risk to rising sea levels, acidification, and coral dieback. Countries like Kiribati, Tokelau, Tuvalu, and they really are faring the worst and have the most to lose because there's potential for total inundation. This slide talks to it here in Tarawa, the capital of Kiribati, where people have resorted to using tyres to fill with coral sand and so on to build up bulwarks against the tide. But also, of course, as you can see, the human detritus in the lagoon brought in, there's the plastics and so on. These are all stories that we tell through our organisation. But different parts of the Pacific have their own stories to tell, and we just want to be able to amplify their voices and get it out to a larger audience, so that people around the world can understand what the coal face of climate change is and what the canaries in the coal mine are having to deal with, because these are the small island developing states of the Pacific, particularly the low-lying coral atollic nations. They are the canaries in this global coal mine, and their health is an indicator of the health of the rest of the world. I guess beyond this, talking to a regional conference that I went to recently in July, I was in New Caledonia for the start of the global round of talks on the coming decade of the ocean. The Pacific kicked off those talks, those regional talks, to help inform the science that was needed heading into this decade of the ocean, because as we all know, this next decade, how we fare as a species on our planet over the next decade kind of is indicative of how we're going to fare beyond that. And so this next decade has been called the decade of the ocean, and the Pacific is really pushing for indigenous knowledge to help inform the science that is needed to help save the ocean and provide the ocean that we want. Next slide, please. Right, as I was just talking about, the indigenous Pacific knowledge to help save the ocean, but also to inform that science so that there is, so that we have some say in the science, so that it can affect positively our culture going forward, so that we're not, so that our culture isn't lost in the science, and that we don't end up in this kind of next wave of colonialism where we're being overwhelmed by science from elsewhere, where our culture and our practices are lost in it. Because I think for all ocean nations, all island nations, part of the say of our science has to be what's right for us as regions, right for our cultures and our peoples. Next slide, please. And I guess, yeah, Tuvalu, one of the most at-risk, low-lying atoll states. Just to kind of round up what I'm saying on behalf of the Pacific, and I think in the words of the former Prime Minister of Tuvalu, if you save Tuvalu, you save the world. That's Enele Sopoanga. Thank you. Back to you,
Cool.
Introduce Manisha.
Yes, apologies for that. So that was Dominic and I talking about some of the work that we do here in RNZ Pacific, and also it'd be great to now welcome one of our speakers from Mauritius. I'm not sure if it's good morning or good evening there to MANISHA, DEENA. So welcome on board.
Thank you, MOERA. Good morning from Mauritius. Hello to everyone present. I am from the island of Mauritius. I started this slide, I'm sorry. Yes. I'm sorry about this. So yes, I am a multimedia journalist from at La Sentinelle, which is one of the leading media group in Mauritius with over 30 publications. It is an honor for me it is a pleasure for me to speak about the state of journalism in Mauritius. This will give you an idea of the challenges we face to just inform communities about climate change or about any other major issues. One of the main things I can say from experience is that the Mauritius press is vibrant. It seeks to inform its audience, it seeks to provoke debates, and it is definitely safe to say that we are a stable democracy with many newspapers, media outlets, commercial radios, and as you can see from the slide, according to the global ranking for press freedom, Mauritius came 58 in 2019. However, we did lose 2 places compared to last year. We are yet to have a commercial TV to compete with the national broadcaster, which is the Mauritius Broadcasting Corporation. We have the Media Trust in Mauritius, a body designed to set the standards of journalism, but it is there mostly as a statutory presence. Over the last decade in Mauritius, one of the main demands of the media, of the population in general, has been to develop a new media law. The current one is undeveloped and without any legislative provision for freedom of information. Actually, a Freedom of Information Act was promised by the current government since the last general elections, which were held in December 2014. What you can see right now is an extract from the electoral manifesto. So it is in French, but it's just that the government promised to consolidate democracy by introducing the Freedom of Information Act. But up till now, it has not become a reality. What we need, what we recommend is the new media law, a Freedom of Information Act, which has been long promised. It will help not only by enhancing the legal freedom of journalists and broadcasters in their job to report news that are relevant in a democracy, but it will also ensure that accuracy, fairness, respect for citizen privacy while having this freedom are encouraged and enforced. We cannot have it one way and we should not. And according to the Mauritius Constitution and under the Human Rights Convention to which Mauritius is a party, every citizen has the right to free expression. Unfortunately, in October 2018, last year, there was a controversial amendment that was introduced in our parliament and voted. A judicial and legal provisions bill was discussed. This provision amended the section 46 of our Information and Communication Technologies Act. Why do I say it is controversial? It is because it is perceived as an attempt to silence internet users, including us media. The new provision makes it an offense to post any message, whether in the form of speech or other sound, data, text, writing, images, signs, signals, or code, or any form of combinations that is likely to cause annoyance or inconvenience to any person. This was not in these words, just by including these words, they changed everything in the law. The amendment went as far as removing the requirement of the plaintiff to prove the intention of the user was to cause annoyance or inconvenience. The government tried to justify saying the legislation is meant to protect children from sexual predators online, but it was clear, it was a clear violation of our freedom of expression. We do feel it's a huge step backwards in our quest to achieve a freedom of information. I have to add as well, in June 2016, the Speaker of the National Assembly here in Mauritius banned the editor-in-chief of a news magazine of La Sentinelle from the National Assembly for 4 sessions. Why? Because she did an editorial about the speaker. She did not appreciate her writing, so she banned her. In 2017, 3 journalists from the same group, my colleagues again, were nearly arrested because they revealed disturbing information about the ex-Attorney General. He had to resign from his post because of the reports, but the government was clearly not happy about what the journalist had written. But I can assure you that all these forms of intimidation do not stop journalists from doing their job in Mauritius. Last July, I'm sure you must have, if you have heard of the Mauritius Leaks, the report by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists came out. Documents were leaked and showed how laws in Mauritius help corporations to avoid attacks globally. Once again, government was not happy about it. The Prime Minister of Mauritius himself tried to demean the report, but the journalists only did their job. We cannot force the authorities to respect their responsibilities, but they have to be accountable for their decisions they make. And for the decisions they are not making as well. And we journalists, the different media, we are not giving up on this fight. We are still encouraging future governments to introduce the new media law, the new Freedom of Information Act. The next general elections are coming up in 3 weeks. Does that mean we will finally have our new media law? We are definitely maintaining the pressure, and we are making our voices heard through different platforms. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was selected to participate in the UN General Assembly through the Island Voices campaign journalism. I had the chance to speak about different challenges that my island face. I hope that through this virtual summit as well, that I do make a difference as a journalist, because Mauritius is considered from its location in the Indian Ocean, it's a very vulnerable island subject. It's exposed to climate change. We have been having heavy rainfall for the past years. A few years ago, 11 people died from flash floods, which was flash floods were not even known to Mauritian people before. We were used to having heavy rainfall, but not flash floods. So it showed how not prepared we were to face these kind of situations. And we hope that the government come together and step up their efforts in dealing with these situations. Thank you for listening to me. I'm open to any questions. Thank you very much.
And in Mauritius, is it, in terms of climate stories, how well received or supportive is the government about such stories?
You mean the Mauritian government?
Yeah.
Well, our leaders on international platforms, for example, the president of Mauritius was present at the UN General Assembly as well. So he said that the country was committed, but we want to see concrete actions as well. You know, it's one thing to make big speeches at on different platforms, but it's another to actually see concrete actions and that make difference in people's lives.
In the region, there are quite a lot of NGOs who are really, really strong in terms of their media coverage. Is that the same in Mauritius?
Yes, yes, we do have NGOs who sometimes work alongside journalists to accentuate the pressure on the government, because things will happen from working together, from joining hands. So yes, we do work together with NGOs. They are here, they are present in the.
Supporting independent journalism, is that a big thing there?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Oh, sorry. I think too, so in the Pacific, there are some governments that are really, really obviously very proactive about, climate stories, climate change stories. But then there are some governments where issues like climate change, if it's obviously logging in some parts of the region, so that's a big issue. And when it involves businesses, possibly mining companies, logging companies, then those governments tend to stay a little bit quiet about issues that affect the environment. Is that the same there?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last sentence.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, because I think when they are moving the iPad, I think it's making the sounds.
Oh, can you hear me now okay?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Cool. I just wanted to touch base. So in the Pacific, there are some governments that are really proactive about climate stories, and they're really, really open about how it affects their countries. But then there are some other countries in the region when, say, businesses in terms of logging is a real concern in the region, deforestation in Solomon Islands and in Papua New Guinea, and obviously there are mining companies. That's a really, really big concern. In those countries, the governments are often quite quiet about those types of things, like especially when it does kind of, that has that business element.
I would say that here in Mauritius, the government is quiet, or they are not as proactive as you were saying in the Pacific region. So that's exactly what journalists from Mauritius, the NGOs, are asking for, to be more proactive, because there are people who are waving the red flag, who through blogging, as you said, through videos, through the different platforms. But unfortunately, it's the actions which are missing. Once again, it's the actions which are missing. We are hearing a lot of things. We know people are concerned. We know from different posts that people know what is happening. They know what are the dangers which are lurking. But those people do not have the power to change, to make concrete decisions. It's at the level of the government. They have the power to change things. And what about in your country? Have you? I know that every country faces climate change, but how do you think your country, your government the authorities at your country have been dealing with the climate change issue?
I think our government has, one issue definitely has been the waterways here. So farming in New Zealand and dairy farming is a very big thing in this country. But there's also been various NGOs that have been concerned about pollution into the streams. So there was, the government announced, it must have been a couple of months ago, about a big cleanup process. So that has been quite good for people. But it's difficult in some cases. There's other measures. So not so long ago, the government announced the banning of plastic bags in our country, and that was quite good. I mean, we know that across the region, that has really come from the Pacific. Vanuatu first to announce that they were banning plastic bags. We're a bit slow here in New Zealand, we're just caught up, but it's certainly something, initiative that has really come from the region, so I think that's really good. The thing is too, though those countries are quite small, in terms of the action that they decide to take, it's really quite impressive.
Can I also just jump in here on that one? I think part of the reason for a more responsive aspect from our government to issues related to climate and the environment and so on is also driven by a change of government we had nearly 2 years ago, which is far more responsive to those issues.
You've been talking about plastic, yes, in Mauritius as well. Plastics were banned, but because they block gutters, drains, and that's one of the things which cause flooding. So it's some small decisions that do have a great impact on the long run, you know. But I was curious to know about how you are allowed to treat information in your country if something is not going well, if decisions are not being taken to cater for climate change or any other main issues in your country.
So if a journalist is researching a story, they can actually enact an Official Information Act, which actually is legislation that they can go to any government organisation and request information. They're often given 20 days to be able to reply to that. If you don't feel, as the journalist, satisfied with the answer that has been given, you can actually go to the Ombudsman and complain. And I know that the Ombudsman is a bit snowed under, but they actually are pretty good. And that's the one thing too that we know here at RNZ Pacific in our team, that we are actually really fortunate about how we can cover stories in the region. We realise how really challenging it can be for some of our colleagues, just in terms of threats and the governments in those smaller countries often really kind of dictate how a story should be run. So it's really important for us that if, you know, we've had some of our correspondents send us stories and say, look, we don't feel safe, or this is not the story that we can actually cover, but if your team could actually do that, so that's quite good for us. And we recognise we're quite lucky that we can actually just go home, whereas we know that for some of our colleagues in the region that can be quite challenging.
Yeah. So I think there's a question that James sent on the webinar chat. So, covering Pacific stories.
I'll just jump in on the voice if you don't mind, because actually I can't submit the questions in the Q&A as the moderator. So for Dominic or MOERA, really, I'm curious that you mentioned about the issues of the diaspora in Australia, New Zealand, beyond, and obviously you two are both members of that diaspora. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about if there's any, I guess, conflict or differences in terms of how diaspora issues are covered or perceived versus local, or just curious if you have any other comments, if there's a divergence in interests, or even that you have to take into account that you are diaspora. Any comments on that would be interesting.
That's a little bit politically charged, that one.
Okay, no worries if you
well, no, I think I can talk to that. There's within New Zealand, within Aotearoa, we are becoming increasingly more confident and comfortable as being a member of the Pacific, as being a Pacific Island country ourselves these days. And we look towards the warmth of the Pacific rather than look back towards Europe as we used to predominantly in the past. So for the people of the Pacific diaspora, of which there are many in New Zealand, I think our place in this society is becoming increasingly more comfortable and increasingly our own. But having said that, even within the media here, which the media landscape is changing as well, but it doesn't always adequately reflect the perspectives of an increasingly diverse population, and perhaps to some degree it hasn't quite caught up with the voices of the new face of New Zealand, which is increasingly less white, less European, and more from other countries closer by.
And I think too, I'll just quickly touch base here, I think too, if you look at the numbers, so Niue, a tiny Pacific nation, really stunning and amazing, there are possibly maybe 1,100 people that live on Niue, but in New Zealand there are probably over 11,000 Niueans that live here. So there's those types of connection, but it can also be difficult for when you go back to the homelands, and especially if you weren't born there, and there can be some of those challenges as well faced with, you know, how we think things should be run, but we don't actually live in the home island, so that's always it can be a challenging thing as well.
We've had another question come in. This one's from Gerard Princeton, or Jared Princeton. Apologies if I've got your name wrong there, but asking, to what extent do we think New Zealand is able and willing to be open to climate change refugees? And made a comment that Auckland is already labelled the largest city of the Pacific. And also likewise for Australia, the same question is being applied. Moira, how do you feel about that?
You know, it's a lot of Pacific people don't want to leave their homes. That's often, so it takes a lot actually, and I think too that people really, you know, it's probably sad for the people most affected because they can't have a voice as much in how their future really is decided. In some places in the region, I think in Kiribati, they bought some land in Fiji for, you know, in case if it did actually, things got a lot worse there, that there would be a patch of land in Fiji that Kiribati people could go live at. But it's a lot for people to leave their communities. And there's parts in Papua New Guinea, I think from the Cataracts Islands from memory, where they were underwater and had serious threat of climate change, but their people did not want to leave. They're so attached to their land. It's not just land for them, it's, you know, their heritage, where their dead are buried.
It's their ancestors.
It's a lot.
In terms of willingness, I think both Australia and New Zealand have a very strong focus on the Pacific, and knowing, and I think the governments of both countries recognise that the people of the Pacific do not want to leave their homes. And New Zealand has a Pacific reset, what's called the Pacific reset policy, which is resetting itself towards the Pacific. And Australia likewise has this, what they call the step up policy. And both of these countries are putting a lot of resource, time and effort into helping our Pacific neighbours adapt to the effects of climate change and make sure that everything is being done to mitigate these changes. But also within that, as part of these policies, both countries are doing their best to amplify the Pacific voice and the voice of those worst affected by climate change, to avoid that potential in the future of having climate change refugees. But I guess if worst came to worst, I'm pretty sure this country would have a pretty open arms policy. But then again, that's just speculation based around the rhetoric of a relatively new government in this country.
Do you think that having a prime minister or a government with a changed mindset and with a different approach in dealing with communities, in dealing with issues, does that help to go forward and find solutions and to these issues?
I think she's very receptive to the Pacific, and certainly the Pacific love her. And I think that helps us out. Also, part of her caucus and her government, there are quite a lot of Pacific, different Pacific people in the caucus, and I think that she looks to them when there is advice in dealing with Pacific issues. But yeah, I think it is a really difficult situation, and often people, I think, don't understand, the climate refugees. Often they're like, I've heard people had conversations about the fact that, everyone's just hoping to, get on to and get into New Zealand, and use that climate issue, but it really is. And I go back to the fact that a lot of those people don't want to leave their countries. They're really in desperate situations actually when they do have to finally leave, and that's probably the most heartbreaking thing, really.
Do we have any other questions from anyone out there? I have a couple of questions. Where are people tuned in from? Where have people logged in from? And also, if you could just give us a sense of that, and also tell us what sector you work in as well, please. Yeah, so there's a poll up now asking from where do you consider home?
Mauritius is always considered as part of the African continent, despite being an island away from the continent itself, but we are always considered as being from Africa.
And also, so Mauritius is English and French, isn't it?
Yes, we study both French and English from school from 6-7 years old, so we can speak both languages fluently. Yes.
And what is the
yes.
sorry, Manisha, what is the religious base of the country?
Oh, so we have the country. We have it's a multicultural country. We have people from Indian origin. We have Hindus. We have nearly 50% of the country's population, which is about 1.2 million people. They are Hindus from the Hindu community.
Right.
So it's Tamil, Telugus, and a big percentage of the rest of the populations are Muslim. And we have people from the Chinese community as well, and of course from the Christian community as well. So yes, we celebrate the main festivals together. We have public holidays for example, Mahashivratri, for Christmas, for Eid. So yes, it's a multicultural community here.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the same?
Well,
yeah.
I think,
in New Zealand.
yeah, I think increasingly, we've traditionally in the past had a predominantly Christian heritage as well as religious persuasion, multi-denominational, Anglicans, Catholics, and so on. But in the last census, the number of people who identify as Christian within our country has dropped significantly, and other religions have grown commensurately in place. But there are quite a few people in this country who identify as having no religion.
Yes, in Mauritius as well. So unfortunately, the last census here was carried out 8 years ago. So we do not have an updated, data, but we know that there are communities growing from, we have people who do not, they are not attached to religion at all. Yeah, they do not want to to be considered as having a religion. Yeah.
I just wanted to know, what's the population of Mauritius?
It's 1.2 million people.
We're just over 4 million here.
Okay. We have a lot of tourists as well. So the incoming tourists per year is nearly the same as the population of Mauritius itself. So we have nearly 1 million people, tourists coming to Mauritius every year.
Can I just jump in and say, I see that Jimmy Obed is in here from Vanuatu, is logged in. Jimmy, we met in New Caledonia in July. Hello.
Awesome one.
Awesome one.
Japan as well.
All the polls results have come back in, and people have identified most strongly from academia and public sector, a third from each, with journalism and other coming in at 17% each.
Hi, this is James. I was just going to say, I know that you answered some of the questions kind of in with some text, Dominic, but maybe there's some of those that you answered that you could just briefly discuss for the next 5 or 10 minutes before we wrap up.
Okay, great. Thank you, James. I'll just get those Q&As back up. Yes, so as James was saying, we had a few questions that came up. I guess start with the right. Yeah, Barrett Moore asked, do we have examples where successful displacements have worked and the cultural values were taken on board? And this is to do, I guess, with in the sense of climate change refugees in the region and so on. And Jared Princeton said one example of displacement or relocation or expanding community space could be the Carteret Islands community. This is one that MOERA mentioned. Next to Bougainville, Caritas, New Zealand has a lot of engagement with the Carteret Islanders. But I guess I brought up the in the writing there about, and I know that MOERA mentioned it in conversation as well, in her presentation, that the people of Kiribati and the government of Kiribati has bought land in Fiji, and also the Fiji government has offered land to both the peoples of Kiribati and the people of Tuvalu as a safety backstop. But as MOERA mentioned, these people want to stay home. These people have their own lands and will do everything they can to protect them. And I guess the other example of successful displacement, if you can call any displacement successful, because of course it's not, but the indigenous people of Banabas, otherwise known as Ocean Island, Banabas and Nauru in the Pacific were two uplifted coral atolls that were rich in phosphate and were mined by an Australian, New Zealand and British conglomerate that basically decimated the islands to extract phosphate from them. And the indigenous people of Banabas were relocated to Fiji, where most of them still remain, and they remain with their culture and language largely intact and their own identity as a result.
And I'm sorry, I keep jumping in, but I'm really interested that you mentioned that Paulinisi Alofa, who's speaking on the Climate Action panel later.
Right.
Banaba origin from Kiribati. And so she'll be talking, would encourage people to join that. And the other thing I was going to say was I actually stayed in the village where the land was purchased by Kiribati in Fiji. It's on the second biggest island in Fiji, and was one of there's not been that many people who actually made it to the village because it's a very remote situation.
Right. Yes.
The reason I mention that is because as actually staying there, one of the problems is, yes, Kiribati bought this land and they want to relocate. Not that they want to relocate people, but there's an opportunity to relocate people in a worst case scenario. But the challenge is there are actually already Fijian citizens living on that land. And so you have a risk of kind of double displacement of what happens there, that gets complicated even further by the fact that those people, although they might look and sound Fijian to outsiders, they're actually of Solomon Island descent from blackbirded, so they don't have the same indigenous land rights. And so it's quite a complicated story that sometimes doesn't get looked at in that much depth. I'm happy to share the report that I wrote, although it was 3 or 4 years ago now.
I think actually we ran that story. Someone interviewed you, James, from
yeah.
here.
Yes, it was a
Koro.
Koro, yeah, that was about 3 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll drop it in the chat. Let me see if I can find the link. But sorry, I just wanted to mention that.
Yes, it's interesting. The blackbirder stories, the displacement and then the relocation of many blackbirded peoples and families. I'm not sure if all of you listening know the history of blackbirding, but it's essentially people that were tricked or stolen into forced labour, indentured labour, to work in the sugarcane field, largely in the sugarcane fields of Queensland. And then many of whom were from what is now Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands. And then some of them were sent back to their islands, supposedly sent back to their islands, but sometimes sent back to the wrong islands. Shall we have a look at another one of these earlier questions? We had another question saying, how can we use these kinds of case studies, again, this is around relocation and climate change, to better understand what it means to be a climate refugee? That's a really tough question. How can we kind of use these examples that we know about to better create broader understanding of it? I said in my written answer, by supporting independent journalism and media. I would love to know the answer to that.
And I think while we obviously look at the science about the climate crisis and talk to NGOs, it's also really important to tell the stories and hear the voices of the people most affected by this. That's the other thing I think that's really important, that, you know, while scientists and FAB get all those other different platforms, and also while NGOs, it's the voices really on the ground, the people that live their day-to-day lives, and they see those changes and they see the ocean coming a bit closer. And I think it's really good to get those voices out just as equally, because they're obviously the ones that are most affected by it.
Yeah,
And it's people. Sorry, you carry on, Manisha.
No, you can go on.
I was just going to mention again that name, Pelenise Alofa. She's one person who works for an NGO in Kiribati, and she's very good at getting those stories, helping getting those stories out from people at the cold face of climate change. Who, you know, when I spoke with her during the last king tide and so on, she was an incredible amplifier of other people's voices and getting those stories out to a broader audience.
And that's the importance, I guess, for some of those leaders in the region who are obviously advocates and recognise the climate crisis, that they really, when they go to the UN or they go to talk on some big international event, they really carry their people on their shoulders.
Yes, I was just referring to the use of native language. There was a question on this. How far do you use native language while covering the news?
So for us, we have language bulletins in Cook Islands Māori, Niuean, Tongan, French, Samoan, and Solomon Islands Pidgin. So yeah, and we have a lot of MOUs with different media organisations that actually translates a lot of our stories into the Pacific languages as well. So everyone, you know, can hear what those stories are about. So that's really important.
And in this age of social media and electronic transmission and sharing of stories and so on, it is incredible how far and wide these stories are shared. And the other thing that is so apparent to me now is the Pacific peoples around the world, among the diaspora, are still very tight within their own communities because regardless of the tyranny of distance, we're all chatting to our families and friends, our fellow villagers on Facebook or whatever that your medium is.
Yeah.
So issues at the village level are shared beyond the village quite rapidly.
Yeah, very much so.
In Mauritius as well, we are encouraging the government to introduce the Mauritian Creole in Parliament, because in Parliament they only speak English or French. They are not allowed to debate in Mauritian Creole, but the population has been asking for it because it concerns them. So why not in Mauritian Creole?
So is Mauritian Creole the most popular tongue?
Yes, yes, it is.
So that's
Then
the
we have
indigenous.
English, French, and as I said, in school we also learn one of our Asian language. For example, I'm from Hindu origin. I can speak Hindi as well. But I have my friends from the Muslim community who learned Arabic or Urdu. It depends. We learn it in school. So.
Right.
It's fantastic.
Thank you.
It's so wonderful hearing stories from other island nations.
Yes, that's true. That's true. I think that's one of the main aims of this summit, is to be able to share our stories and hopefully get.
Though we are in different places, our stories all are very similar.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. We even years before we would not have known that our country, for example, the island of Mauritius or New Zealand, could have so many things in common, but we do have them.
We've just had a comment from Jimmy Obed, who wanted to support MOERA about hearing stories from the people and how very important it is to be better understood and better understand the communities and how they perceive climate change and when it comes to migration. Jimmy says Vanuatu had to evacuate an entire island following a volcanic activity, and he had the opportunity to sit with villagers and hear their thoughts about the evacuation process, the decision made by government with little involvement by the community. And Jimmy thinks media plays an important role in being the voice of the community. Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, so that was a fantastic discussion. I think feel free to give your the final comments and wrap up, unless there's any other comments that you wanted to discuss.
I like the idea that this virtual summit connects people from all over the world, and that though we might be in different parts, we all share similar stories and similar issues that obviously are going on in our communities, and that we think it's really important to be able to give that a voice as well. So yeah, thanks so much, James, for suggesting this.
Yes, thank you, James, for letting us letting our voices be heard through this summit.
And from me as well, James, thank you very much for connecting us and for helping island voices being amplified and to hear each other's stories. It's fascinating and wonderful, and I'm really quite touched. Thank you again.
Thank you all so much for joining. We'll just give a final mention to our main partner, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. There's no one joining from there this morning. I think it's about 3 a.m. in St. Lucia, but they're an important partner for putting this together. So thank you very much to the three of you for taking part, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.